In this series, we'll be going over all of the cards banned in the commons only format, Pauper, and discussing why they're banned if they can be unbanned today. This video will be going through some of Pauper's earliest bans back when it was an online exclusive format, as well as the bans that came most quickly after a card's printing to look at some cards that were generally just too strong for Pauper in the first place. The first card we'll be covering is Cranial Plating, an equipment artifact that costs 2 generic mana and had an equip cost of 1 generic mana. The equipped creature gains +1 power for each artifact you control, and may pay 2 black mana to attach Cranial Plating to another creature you control at instant speed. This card was banned in December of 2008. So why was Cranial Plating banned? The card made aggressive artifact decks too powerful. Aggressive artifact decks were able to leverage Cranial Plating's attack boost to threaten massive damage if the opponent wasn't careful. If your opponent left even one creature unblocked, you could pay the mana to attach Cranial Plating to that creature and steal a chunk of damage. There was also the added benefit of having a lot of power coming from a non-creature permanent. Not only did this mean that your creature removal would usually not be able to hit Cranial Plating, but even if your creature was removed, you could just move the equipment to a new one and keep up the pressure. The only real cost was needing a high density of artifacts on board. This was especially easy considering that the Mirrodin artifact lands allowed you to cast more artifacts while also counting as one themselves. And considering those lands were all at common even at the time of Pauper's introduction, this synergy would have been fully available in the format without bans. Cranial Plating saw success during its time in Standard, as well as consistent results in non-rotating formats like Modern. While Cranial Plating itself was never banned in any of these formats, it was one of the key cards for the deck and one of its strongest. As such, Wizards was concerned with allowing the card to run rampant in the new format and pre-banned it out of precaution. Aggressive artifact decks like Affinity have proven powerful without Cranial Plating, to a point where there are more cards on the ban list specifically because of these aggressive artifact decks. Could Cranial Plating be unbanned? No. As we just said, there are quite a few cards banned specifically because of Affinity's power level in Pauper, and Cranial Plating is far and away the strongest. At the time of recording, Affinity is one of the better decks in the format, and would be even more explosive and resilient with access to cards like Cranial Plating. Affinity even has access to cards like Gingerbrute, which did not exist when Cranial Plating was banned. Gingerbrute can only be blocked by creatures with haste if you pay 1 generic mana, meaning that with enough artifacts you'd be able to force through lethal with Cranial Plating relatively easily. And that's without even considering the introduction of bridges, indestructible artifact lands that tap for 2 colors and allow Affinity to build easily into any color combination, and increase options more than ever. Cranial Plating was too powerful back when the deck only had the monocolor artifact lands to work off of. Now there are enough artifact lands in the format that many Affinity builds run 2 or less non-artifact lands. Cranial Plating even has a direct comparison in All That Glitters, an aura that gives the enchanted creature +1 power toughness for each artifact and enchantment you control. This effect offers more stats in exchange for not being able to move it to other creatures. And despite the lack of flexibility, All That Glitters is a powerful card that some builds of Affinity have retooled to play around. How could Cranial Plating be fixed to be unbanned? Its most glaringly overtuned feature is its ability to attach itself at instant speed. This makes it impossible for an opponent to effectively block, since Cranial Plating can just be moved to wherever it's most problematic. If you could only equip this card with its inherent sorcery speed equipment cost, the card would still be potent, but perhaps not quite as ban-worthy. The fact that All That Glitters isn't ban-worthy as an aura proves that there is at least a fair version of this sort of effect that can exist. The question just is, how much power does Cranial Plating have to sacrifice? And even then, if both were legal together, Affinity might overtake the format even with Cranial Plating hypothetically getting nerfed. To more dramatically rein in the card, one could also make it only track either creature or non-creature artifacts instead of both, limiting the output of Cranial Plating altogether. Although, if you could still freely equip it at instant speed, it would likely still be quite playable. The next card to have this level of impact on Pauper was Frantic Search. This instant costs 2 generic and 1 blue mana, and draws 2 cards and discards 2 cards. Then you untap up to 3 lands. Due to the nature of MTG Go at the time of Pauper's introduction, many older sets had not yet been released into Arena. One such set was Urza's Legacy, which was added to the client in 2010, then swiftly banned in June of 2011. Why was Frantic Search banned? It pays for itself by untapping the lands used to cast it. If any of your lands tap for 2 or more mana, you can even go positive on mana from casting Frantic Search. This made the card generically quite powerful in a wide variety of blue decks, but most particularly Frantic Search supercharged Storm decks in particular. Storm is a mechanic that copies itself for each spell cast before this turn, regardless of who cast it. As such, decks have been built to simply cast as many spells as possible in a single turn to get a game-winning number of Storm copies on the stack. This mechanic is so powerful that multiple formats have had Storm as one of their most prominent decks, and with several commons with the Storm keyword, Pauper was no exception. Initially, Wizards did not want to outright ban the deck out of playability, instead opting to ban Frantic Search given how powerful an enabler it was for the deck. Storm decks often played spells known as rituals, which generate more mana than they cost, which is usually balanced by the fact that the mana is temporary. Most decks would rather develop their boards than dedicate too many slots to rituals. However, Storm decks use rituals to both cast more spells to raise the Storm count, but also keep generating mana to cast more spells. These rituals made Frantic Search even more powerful, since that ritual mana could be used to help cast Frantic Search, which could in turn untap lands that provide more relevant colors. Despite costing blue, Frantic Search was ironically a consistent way for Storm decks to cheat up more access to blue mana in hands without access to Manamorphous. The banning of Frantic Search did little to dampen the power of Storm decks in the format, although that speaks more to the power of Storm than anything. Could Frantic Search be unbanned? No. Frantic Search, if unbanned, would slot right into several decks into the format. Not only would spell-centric combo decks like Storm want the card, even slower decks like Dimir Terror will be likely able to find enough value from the card selection and graveyard fuel it provides. Mana efficiency is important in Pauper, given the general weakness of commons compared to a lot of other rarities. A card that is essentially free and sets up decks further is just too good for the format. It's hard to imagine blue decks that would not want to run Frantic Search for one reason or another. It just offers too much tempo, allowing you to sculpt your hand and graveyard on turn 3 while still developing a threat or just developing resources further. Even when played completely fair with no combo or storm potential, the card would still put you ahead and only really cost you if it's countered. How could Frantic Search be fixed to be unbanned? Frantic Search could be unbanned if it were not inherently mana neutral. If it only untapped 1 or 2 lands, then you would have to use an additional card or land that specifically taps for more than 1 mana to abuse it. As it currently exists, there's just too many ways to break the card, and there's no real cost to playing it beyond already being at 3 mana. The only other reasonable option would be to raise its mana value to the point of unplayability, although that is somewhat against the spirit of fixing a card. Frantic Search is just a relic of a highly experimental time and magic card design, and the sort of design that has not really been revisited much. These days, spells often refund themselves through treasures, which have broken Pauper in their own way, and the even more powerful method of untapping is generally left off the table, barring splashy mythic rares. Storm decks continue to be a menace to the format despite the loss of Frantic Search. These decks would need to be addressed on further ban lists, and again, basically any time Wizards makes the mistake of printing another playable common with the keyword. The first was Grapeshot, which costs 1 generic and 1 red mana for a sorcery that deals 1 damage to any target, and of course had the ability Storm. It was banned alongside Empty the Warrens, another Storm spell which costs 3 generic and 1 red mana and creates 2 goblin creature tokens with 1 power and toughness. Both spells were banned in February 2013 and marked the beginning of a hot streak of Storm bans for the format. They were swiftly followed by Temporal Fissure, which costs 4 generic and 1 blue mana and can return target permanent to its owner's hand. After this, Storm went quiet for a while as all of the best commons with keywords were banned, up until Modern Horizons 2 reintroduced Storm as a draft archetype and by extension printed new Storm commons. Chatterstorm costs 1 generic and 1 green mana to create a squirrel token with 1 power and toughness. It was banned in September 2021, and it only took a few months longer for the other notable Modern Horizons 2 Storm spell, Galvanic Relay, to also get hit. Galvanic Relay also costs 2 generic and 1 red mana, has Storm, and allows you to exile the top card of your library and play it during your next turn. It was banned in March of 2022, and to this day is the most recent Storm spell on the list. Why were the Storm spells banned? Grapeshot's low mana value alongside its direct damage made it an ideal win condition in Storm decks in various formats, especially in 2013. While casting 20 spells in 1 turn was a tall order for most decks, it was not impossible for a properly built Storm deck, and even if you couldn't kill your opponent outright with Grapeshot, you drop them so low that the follow-up turn would need very little further cards to pull out a win. Since each copy could have a new target, you'd also be able to use Grapeshot to clear out threatening boards that would kill you before you get enough damage to kill your opponent. While Empty the Warrens is a less overt way of winning the game than Grapeshot, since you still need to attack with these goblin tokens to win, this is often a more resilient way for a Storm player to navigate their win. Empty the Warrens rewards Storminaut by producing a wall of goblins to both chump block with to set up for future Storm turns, or just go on the aggressive. Considering Pauper generally lacks when it comes to mass removal, it also meant that answering the goblin tokens usually came through the slow process of trading out in combat. Even if an opponent had blockers, you generally could make enough tokens that they simply couldn't block enough damage over a few turns of attacks. These 2 spells together made Storm far and away the best deck in the format, even without Frantic Search. And mirror matches often just came down to who went for the win first with the most options in hand. Once they were gone, Temporal Fissure was left legal to try and allow Storm to exist in some capacity, which quickly proved to be a mistake. Temporal Fissure cost more than the previous spells and lacked any direct way of ending the game since it only returned target permanent to its owner's hand. However, Pauper, especially at this time, was known for its ability to cheat on mana. This meant for many decks, not just dedicated Storm decks, Temporal Fissure was a one-sided upheaval, able to bounce not only all of your opponent's threats, but also every land they currently controlled as well. This massive tempo swing would set your opponent back several turns, to a point where the Temporal Fissure player would almost certainly run away with the game from there. The Modern Horizons 2 Storm cards were designed with years of hindsight, and were designed with Pauper in mind on some level. While Chatterstorm produced half the tokens of Empty the Warrens, costing half the mana as well helped make up the difference and, if anything, made it stronger than Empty the Warrens, given it requires less investment of mana. The card was especially lethal when paired alongside the board-wide haste enabler First Day of Class, which had been printed between Storm's periods of playability, allowing the army of tokens to swing for lethal damage the turn they were created. Galvanic Relay is by far the weakest of the bunch. It essentially was a Storm card that existed only to set you up for the follow-up turn. Even then, it was so good in red-black Storm decks using Experimental Synthesizer that it too wound up being banned. You'd often just go for a medium-sized Storm turn with Galvanic Relay to draw into enough cards that, on the next turn, you just kill them outright through other means, or just set up a massive value turn that your opponent could never match. Could the Storm spells be unbanned? No. To this day, it's arguable that Grape Shot is still the strongest common Storm spell ever printed, to a point where unbanning it is unlikely. There are far more enablers for the strategy in the format now, and the reintroduction of Grape Shot into the format would likely just catapult the deck right back up to top tier contention. Some could say that Grape Shot is the least likely card to be unbanned in the format, given how many clearer, weaker Storm cards have been banned after it. As for Empty the Warrens, it is arguably easier to unban in part thanks to its high mana value, straining the already tight mana production of Storm decks. And unlike Grape Shot, the format does have some means of reasonably answering the tokens produced by Empty the Warrens. That said, there are only so many answers, and black is really the only color with access to them, so it's hard to say unbanning Empty the Warrens is all that likely. Especially since these big mana decks don't tend to mine the mana value of 4 when it's the last spell they cast. And while big mana decks, especially Storm, are not as strong as they used to be, there's still more than enough mana generation and ability to Storm in the format that Temporal Fissure is still arguably too powerful to be unbanned, since it essentially erases your opponent's entire board process to a point where it's near impossible to catch up. Capsize is a card known for its ability to slowly take over a game by bouncing permanents one by one, and Temporal Fissure essentially offers it all in one go if you can muster a decent Storm turn. Chatterstorm essentially being half an Empty the Warrens ironically makes it harder to unban, given it's even more explosive of a Storm spell and easier to capitalize on with middling combo turns. While it has the same weakness that Empty the Warrens does, in that it dies to Pestilence, it similarly only has to worry about such a hard counter from black. Galvanic Relay is the most recent Storm ban and arguably the one that most easily can come off the list, given the sheer impact every other banned Storm spell has. But that said, its status as a recent ban means that the card was already proven to be too good for the Pauper meta. If anything, Galvanic Relay being so comparatively weak should show how impossible it is to unban any of these other spells. How could the Storm spells be fixed? Realistically, there is no way to fix the spells from the format without removing their Storm ability, and thus their entire reason for existing altogether. Storm is such a broken mechanic that Wizards name their internal scale for determining how broken a mechanic is after it. While there are some Storm spells that are still legal in Pauper and even playable, wind up in decks like Cyclade Storm that are weak to Graveyard Hate or other forms of interaction. Pauper Storm decks are just too easily supported by the density of common rarity rituals and draw power to not dominate to a point where the only way to fix these cards would be to remove Storm altogether. Even if you doubled the mana values of some of these spells, it's likely they would still try to play the deck and find success with it. Mind's Desire is a Storm spell with a mana value of 6 that has seen play in multiple formats throughout the years, so simply making these spells cost more likely would not be enough. Pauper's power level is strained too much by conventional Storm decks for any decent effective Storm spells to ever be legal. While other bans would come in the meantime, the next new problem card to the format would come with the release of the Takir block in 2014. Treasure Cruise is a sorcery that costs 7 generic mana and 1 blue mana and draws 3 cards. The keyword ability Delve allows you to exile cards from your graveyard while casting the spell, with each card exiled this way paying for 1 generic mana of the spell's cost. This means if you exiled 7 cards from your graveyard, Treasure Cruise would still just cost 1 blue mana. The card was banned less than a year after its printing in March of 2015. Why was Treasure Cruise banned? Delving away enough cards essentially turned the spell into Ancestral Recall, one of the most powerful Magic cards ever printed. While 7 cards is certainly a lot, the flexibility of Delve meant that if you needed to cast the spell earlier for a bit more mana, you could do so. Delve in general was an extremely powerful ability, but Treasure Cruise in particular proved to be one of the most overpowered designs from the block. To this day, the card is banned in both Modern and Legacy, and even Vintage has it restricted to just 1 copy per deck. It's no surprise then that it took Pauper less than a full year after its printing to also ban Treasure Cruise. There are some arguments that Treasure Cruise is more fair in Pauper than in other formats. Eternal formats have access to fetch lands, which help fill the graveyard much faster, as well as generally more powerful self-mill strategies. However, even at the time of printing, Pauper had many ways of filling the graveyard to facilitate getting a Treasure Cruise quicker. It doesn't help that Pauper is a slowed format that can generally afford to wait a bit longer to cast Treasure Cruise and still get good value from it. Treasure Cruise was just an overwhelming card upon release, and to this day is generally seen as an egregious design mistake, let alone ban-worthy in Pauper. Blue has historically been one of the strongest colors in Pauper since its inception, and Treasure Cruise made it almost the de facto best color of the format during the time of its legality. Could Treasure Cruise ever get unbanned? No. As a comparison, Gurmag Angular is one of the premier creatures in the format thanks to having the Delve keyword. This is the only value that Gurmag Angular offers beyond having decent stats, and that alone is enough for it to be arguably the best black creature of the format. Slower decks fill up the graveyard with land cycling cards and interaction, and then dropping Angular for little to no cost. Treasure Cruise would have all of the same ease of casting, yet instead of being a decent aggressive body, it would instead refill your hand. Treasure Cruise is just generally too powerful for most formats given how its design accidentally made it the second coming of a member of the Power 9. While it is nowhere near as powerful as Ancestral Recall, it remains one of the most powerful draw spells ever printed, and almost certainly too powerful for Pauper with how it has evolved in recent years. While Pauper does not have fetch lands, it has in the years since gained access to land cycling cards, which serve a similar purpose to fetch lands in both fixing and filling the graveyard with fodder cards. It's easier than ever to fill your graveyard in Pauper, to a point where blue-black decks would run Gurmag Angular and Treasure Cruise together without much trouble. How could Treasure Cruise be fixed? Treasure Cruise is another card where it's hard to fix without outright ruining it. The nature of Delve makes it so that unless its mana costs were well over double digits, it would still likely be playable. As such, the only real other options are to make it draw less cards. If it were a Divination instead of an Ancestral Recall, then it might have been more reasonable. But even that might be too pushed for the likes of the Pauper format. Making it draw just 1 card would be too far, however, since Pauper already has access to Ponder and much other more powerful cantrips. The only other realistic way of doing so would be to limit how much of its mana cost you're able to pay by delving by giving it more blue pips. If Treasure Cruise cost 5 generic and 3 blue mana, it would be perhaps its most fair iteration, but also far less playable than what was actually printed. 6 generic and 2 blue mana would likely still be too good and push the card to a point of being banned in multiple formats still, especially Pauper. Treasure Cruise exists in a strange spot where it's broken as it currently exists, but most attempts at fixing it would either do nothing or outright ruin the card. Alright, and that's the video. The next video will go over more cards banned quickly upon entering the format, as well as those that were banned once Pauper was upgraded from MTG Go exclusive to an officially sanctioned format. With that being said, do you have any ideas for future videos like this one? If so, let us know down in the comments below.